Welcome, everybody. I just want to begin by thanking our sponsors, and then I'm going to turn it over to Ayana, who's going to introduce our speaker. And the speaker's going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have about 45 minutes for questions, comments, and also announcements if people have announcements from the floor. So thanks to our co-sponsors, who are UVM's Departments of English, History, and Sociology, the Food Systems Graduate Program, Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies Program, and United Academics. Special appreciation to Jen Strickler for booking the room, which anybody at UVM knows is no easy business. And our community co-sponsors are Burlington Peace and Justice Center, Cooperation Vermont, Jewish Voice for Peace, Vermont, New Hampshire, Party for Socialism and Liberation, Tempest Collective Vermont, Vermont Coalition for Palestinian Liberation, Vermonters for Justice in Palestine, and also a few Burlington City Councillors, Milo Grant, Jean Bergman, Carter Newbitzer, Marek Broderick, and Joe Kane. Thank you all. Also, very special thanks to Anne Lipsit, who is the founder of the lecture series and was Will's partner, and the other members of the board, Ron Jacobs, who's here, Fred Magdoff, who's here, also Jaina Asaf. So thank you all. Special shout out to CCTV for filming our lectures. So in such a dedicated fashion over the last 2 decades. Our lectures are always available and can be watched on our YouTube channel. I want to also just remind everybody that the lecture series runs purely on donations, so we encourage and welcome you to give donations so that we can keep on putting on events like this. And you can go to willmiller.org to find out more about how to do that. So this evening, our event is going to be introduced properly by Ayana Curran-Howes, who is a current graduate student in the Food Systems Program and also a member of and a founding member of the Graduate Student Union and a dedicated social justice activist in the spirit of Will Miller. So a very appropriate person to introduce our event. One thing before Ayana starts, Logan has an announcement.
Yes. So, in case anybody, microphone? Oh, yes. Didn't know if this thing was on. Gotcha. So, for anyone who hasn't heard, we are marching from UVM to the district court tomorrow morning to support Mohsen Madawi. If you haven't heard of his case, he was kidnapped by ICE 3 miles north of here in retaliation for his activism against Israel's genocide. And we are marching tomorrow morning with the faculty union, the staff union, the graduate union, and as many students and affiliates as possible to just send a message of support and show that we will fight against this. 7:45 a.m. And we will pass out these flyers for anyone who's interested.
Yeah, the proceedings, everything will start at the Burlington City Federal Building downtown at 8. So, but we're marching from up here around Waterman at 7:45. Awesome. Okay, so my slightly damp paper made it all the way here. We are here tonight as a part of the Will Miller Social Justice Lecture Series, which was set up in 2005 to commemorate Will Miller, a UVM philosophy professor for 35 years and social justice activist who gave us insightful analysis into the origins and workings of capitalism and imperialism, giving us a call to action and a vision of a more just society, a society where all work is valued, truth is not silenced but nurtured, all are treated as equals, peace prevails, and people and resources are free from exploitation. He spread his activism across diverse organizations, including Vermont Veterans for Peace, the Vermont Cuba Committee, and the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, to name just a few. And today we are pushed and pulled in so many directions to care about many things, and WIL is an exemplar of how this can be done, connecting diverse causes and seeing the interconnections between social, ecological, and political justice. Democracy is being repressed right here in Vermont, as Logan was alluding to, is one example. Some members of the City Council striking down community ballot initiatives as well, and the University of Vermont sanctioning certain student groups and canceling the in-person lecture by the Palestinian poet and journalist Mohammed al-Faqih in 2023. And we must be organized and learn from each other now more than ever, taking from these examples. And this year in particular marks 20 years since this series brought its first radical speakers to campus for a conference entitled Vermont Says No to War, with the following year hosting a panel on globalization, immigration, and war, with tonight's lecture series being a continuation of these themes. And now here today, still advocating for justice for immigrants. So as someone pursuing a PhD in food systems, who's been attending migrant justice marches since I first arrived in Vermont, one of my first professors and the director of the food systems program, Teresa Mayers, encouraged us all to attend this protest that was happening down in Portland, Maine, and we all drove down there together, and I was marching alongside my peers and my grandma and my aunt. So this was like quintessential to my start here in Vermont, and I think Migrant Justice is a quintessential organization to be introduced to mark this anniversary. To the present day, you can't attend a rally focused on a variety of social justice issues without seeing and often hearing from migrant justice workers and members. This is an organization that's continuously connecting the exploitation of workers to its deeper origins in economic justice and human rights, and countering these abuses through targeted, successful campaigns and protecting immigrants from deportation. There are workers-driven social responsibility programs, so they're holding companies accountable through this bottom-up, workers-led approach. And often workers in confined animal feeding operations and slaughterhouses today are mainly migrants living with only partial access to human and civil rights and are exposed to some of the most dangerous and deadly diseases and working conditions. And for a stat on this, by 2050, there are predicted to be 10 million antimicrobial resistance deaths due to these facilities, and they're often recruiting vulnerable workers and employing them out of sight and out of mind, and this helps to serve to break up organizing efforts in these spaces to advocate for justice, and this fractures along racial, linguistic, and legal lines. So to date, Migrant Justice has won protections and dignified livelihoods for 256 qualifying workers on 54 participating farms across 2 states, and has just recently made significant headway in their Milk with Dignity campaign with Hannaford. I'm sure Will talk about this. And I know their voice in particular is a salient one to be hearing in the wake of all this amplified oppression. So without further ado, we have Bill Lambeck of Migrant Justice.
All right, thank you, Ayana. Thank you, Helen. Thanks to the Will Miller Lecture Series for having us here, and thanks to all of you for spending a Tuesday night to talk about some very important issues. So I'd like to chat a bit about Migrant Justice's work, some of the larger trends historically and currently surrounding the work that the organization does, and then open it up to a conversation and question and answer. So I'll try to go around 7:45 or 7:50, and then we like to open it up. So just by show of hands, before tonight or before seeing a flyer to come here tonight, who had heard of Migrant Justice before? Great, all right, good chunk of folks. Who's come out to a Migrant Justice rally or a Migrant Justice action or event at some point? Okay, fantastic. Okay, so. As many of you know, Migrant Justice is a Vermont-based organization founded and led by a community of immigrant farm workers organizing the farm worker community in Vermont and beyond to fight for human rights and economic justice. The seeds of Migrant Justice were planted in 2009 after the preventable workplace death of a young farm worker, a 19-year-old from Chiapas, Mexico, named Jose Obeth Santis Cruz, was pulled into a piece of machinery called a mechanized gutter scraper and was strangled to death by his clothing. Jose's death was a catalyst and a spark for a community that up until that point had been invisibilized, to begin to come together and organize for their rights, and began a process of community assemblies, of workers coming together to saying nobody else should have to go home in a body bag. And that process eventually led to the formation of migrant justice. And I use the word invisibilized because over the past several decades, Vermont's dairy industry has come to rely almost entirely on the labor of undocumented immigrants from Mexico and Central America. Yet prior to the creation of migrant justice, that had been a reality which was totally hidden from view. And Vermont then and now puts out a sort of picture postcard version of the dairy industry and of the state that its dairy companies put on their products, that the state puts on its tourist brochures, that our politicians use when they talk about their constituents, including some of our favorite progressive politicians, of the rural pastoral landscape, the rolling green hills, the red barn, and the white fifth-generation dairy worker who's been passed down from generation to generation working the land. And that image bears almost no resemblance to the reality of the industry today, where farms have grown, have had to look for a labor force to meet that growth, and by and large have found that labor force with undocumented workers. So migrant justice began to organize as a way to build the power of this community so that they could begin to tell their own story, to talk about common experiences that they were having on their farms and in the community, and to begin to envision collective solutions. And they pulled together a human rights vision for how to address their reality by getting to the root causes of the problems that they were facing. So the conditions on dairy farms are marked principally by systemic violations of human rights, of abuse, and of exploitation. Does anybody know what the state minimum wage is in Vermont right now? Just went up, $14.01. Any guesses on the median wage for an immigrant dairy worker in Vermont? A little higher, $10.75. 87% of workers in the state of immigrant dairy workers make below the state minimum wage. The average workday is 12 hours or more. Over half of workers are working 12-hour shifts or more in a day. 90% plus are working 6 or 7 days a week, and a full 25% of immigrant dairy workers don't have a day off ever. They're working 7 days a week, around the clock, oftentimes with insufficient time to eat or to rest between shifts. Things like overtime, paid sick leave, paid vacation, and holidays, things that many other workers take for granted, are virtually non-existent. Most dairy workers in the state live in housing provided by employers on the farm property. This is sometimes presented as a benefit for workers, when in reality it's a condition of employment, an extension of the employer's control over an already captive workforce. Conditions are oftentimes overcrowded, substandard, and sometimes downright inhumane. Workers are living packed 12 workers in a leaky trailer designed for 5, people sleeping in common spaces, dealing with pest infestations of cockroaches, bed bugs, and rodents. And at times, workers describe these conditions as unfit for human habitation, worse even than the animals are provided. There are dwellings that are euphemistically called barn apartments. These are essentially living units that are built into or right above the milking parlor with a plywood wall separating the workers from the cows that they milk. One worker I visited recently talked about living above the birthing pen of the cows, where when a cow gives birth, he can feel his bed shake, to give you a sense of the dehumanizing conditions in which workers live. Health and safety issues are, of course, rampant, with astronomical rates of workplace illness and injury, pushed forward by insufficient access to personal protective equipment, training, and safe staffing. So workers are working with dangerous chemicals, heavy machinery, and of course surrounded by cows. This is often leading to serious injury, and in the case of Jose Obet and others, to death. And then a lack of protections, of enforceable protections for things like discrimination, sexual harassment, child labor, and violence means that these things are commonplace in the industry, with women farm workers regularly being told that farms don't hire women, facing explicit discrimination, or being put in gendered roles of calf care with lower salaries and no place for advancement. Women who report sexual harassment or sexual violence on the farm oftentimes find that they're fired as the troublemaker rather than the aggressor or the perpetrator of the violence. The industry is held up by a racialized, segmented labor market, with white workers and citizens in higher paying roles, with better hours, and oftentimes benefits like health insurance and retirement plans that an immigrant worker couldn't even dream of accessing for their roles as the milkers and pushers in the parlors. And violence from employers is sadly commonplace, with workers living under the implicit threat of violence and sometimes seeing that acted upon when disputes turn into beatings from bosses and workers finding little recourse. Even when workers call the police on the cops, that's oftentimes not a path. Even when workers call the police on their bosses after an assault, that's oftentimes not a path to justice. And as we've seen, police come to farms after workers are beaten, only to essentially tell the farmer to take it easy next time.
Can you please speak a little louder?
Of course, thank you very much. So these are some of the conditions that predominated in the dairy industry, and that for much of the industry, although not all of it, and we'll talk about that in a minute, continue to predominate in Vermont's dairy industry. And so to understand why it is that we have an industry that is so crucial to the state's financial well-being, so crucial to the state's identity, yet which is predicated on these systemic violations of human rights, we have to go back a bit to look at the history of agriculture in the United States, which, of course, begins with chattel slavery. U.S. agriculture has always and remains today been premised on the hyper-exploitation of a marginalized and racialized group of workers. And the history of U.S. agriculture after abolition has been the history of an industry looking for ways to perpetuate that servitude post-bellum. So we go from convict leasing in the South to sharecropping, to the internal displacements. Think of the Steinbeck novels of Dust Bowl farmers going to California in the 1930s, to programs like the Bracero program, bringing millions of Mexicans to work in fields in the 1950s, up until today, where the majority of agricultural work done in the United States is done by undocumented immigrants. The history of labor law is also a history of exclusion. So the foundations of U.S. labor law during the New Deal begin with two principal pieces of legislation: the Fair Labor Standards Act and the National Labor Relations Act, which respectively sets minimum wage, the 40-hour work week, and the right to collective bargaining. These pieces of legislation explicitly exclude farm workers as well as domestic workers. Why? For the very well-stated reason at the time that the work being done in those industries at the time was predominantly the descendants of enslaved Africans, and the grand bargain of FDR and the New Deal coalition was to get the Southern white senators' votes by excluding those industries specifically. Agriculture remains largely excluded from those protections, both in federal and state law, which is why 87% of immigrant dairy workers can be paid below the minimum wage, which is, of course, a violation of basic rights and dignity, but it's not a violation of the law, because Vermont minimum wage doesn't extend to farm workers, just like collective bargaining rights in Vermont don't extend to farm workers. The other trend to look at is the immigration policies in the United States and the history of racialized exclusions in immigration policy. What is happening under the Trump administration is more a change in degree than a change in kind. There has been a bipartisan consensus in the federal government for at least the last 40 years for a policy of mass deportation. In every administration, we see deportations increase under both Democrat and Republican presidencies. And in Vermont, what that leads to is a condition of repression almost unimaginable to people who aren't experiencing it. So in Vermont, which is a 95% white state on the northern border, immigrant dairy workers live in what's been referred to as a carceral landscape, living and working on farms and fearing that stepping foot off the farm could lead to one's detention, deportation, and separation from your family and your ability to make a living. This is getting worse at the moment, and we're going to talk about some of the ways in which that's happening, but it's not new. Immigrant farm workers in Vermont have contended with both ICE and Border Patrol for many years now. And when we look at Trump's policies of mass deportation, while we shouldn't ignore or undercount the sort of white supremacist and exterminationist forces within his coalition, the core political economic reasons of a policy of mass deportation isn't to remove immigrant workers. It is to increase repression against immigrant workers to such an extent that they will continue to accept working conditions that they would otherwise reject. You create a sense of political repression so severe that workers will be powerless, or they will attempt to have workers be powerless against economic exploitation. And that's what we see playing out in the dairy industry as well as so many other economic sectors today. The more fear that people experience from the threat of detention or deportation, the more likely employers are to take advantage of that fear to make exploitation and abuse worse for their labor force. So, these are some of the issues that dairy workers faced when they began organizing after the deaths of Ohotheo Beth in 2009. And coming together in Migrant Justice, they began to look at how they could organize to create collective solutions to the problems they were experiencing. An early campaign was a campaign to change the law in Vermont to win access to driver's licenses. And this was more than a mere sort of access to a credential. This was about the human right to freedom of movement. In a situation that I've described where workers are living in their places of employment, oftentimes in extremely rural and isolated areas with, of course, no public transportation to speak of, access to a license is access to freedom of movement. It's the ability to leave the farm, to buy yourself groceries, to go to a park, or to search for other work if you need to leave where you currently are. So workers in 2013 and 2014 began to organize, 2012 and 2013 began to organize, and for the first time ever, dairy workers were going to the Vermont State House, speaking Spanish with legislators. I think some of you were there, maybe. Providing testimony. And this was the first time that Vermont's elected officials and political leadership really had to contend with the fact that at the base of the dairy industry was this exploited workforce and people who were justly and righteously demanding their human rights. Migrant Justice was ultimately successful in winning the campaign for driver's licenses in Vermont. And in 2014, Vermont became just the third state in the country to grant that right. And now there are, I think, 19 states in DC, or maybe a little bit more than that, who have changed their laws to match Vermont's. This was a tremendous victory, not only as from a material standpoint, but for a strategic organizing standpoint. When Migrant Justice was first formed, the way that workers got to assemblies was through intricate and quite cumbersome volunteer networks of solidarity transportation, people going to farms, picking up workers, bringing them to the church basement or the community center so they could meet together, plan strategy for campaigns, and then bring them home at the end of the night. That still continues to this day, but at a reduced rate as more and more members of the organization are able to get licenses and achieve a level of freedom that allows them to organize as well. But with more workers on the road, they were encountering local law enforcement more and more. And it was commonplace at the time for a traffic stop to turn into somebody being turned over to ICE or Border Patrol. Police would racially profile either the driver or the passenger, call immigration authorities, and people would end up being detained. So the next campaign is known in Spanish as No Polimigra, which is a portmanteau in Spanish to combine poli, meaning police, and migra, meaning immigration authorities. So it's a fight against the collaboration between local law enforcement and federal immigration agencies. This has been a long-standing campaign, which continues to this day, but has as its central focus creating a sphere of protection that an encounter with the cops isn't going to get you deported. There's been a lot of twists and turns in the No Polimigra campaign. It sort of started with winning legislation that suggested that Vermont police establish these policies, and the suggestion didn't really work, so then it was back to the State House, and it was mandated that police establish policies, and the policies were sort of scattershot, so workers went back and said, okay, they have to be based on this unitary model policy, and Migrant Justice has to be consulted in the creation of it. And so by iterations, Migrant Justice continued to push forward these protections. And in Vermont, these are known as fair and impartial policing policies. Throughout much of the country, these would be known as sanctuary policies. Though it's an ongoing fight, and we have to remain very vigilant to ensure compliance, overall, this campaign has been very successful in separating Vermont law enforcement from deportation agents and making sure that Vermont cops are not in the business of deportation. This has been very important in reducing the risks of detention and deportation in the state. But getting police out of the equation is just one piece of it. Because even without the force multiplier of local law enforcement, significant as it is, ICE and Border Patrol still have the unfettered run of the state. And as workers are driving to the store or going to the supermarket, they will sometimes encounter ICE or Border Patrol in encounters that end in their detention and ultimate deportation. So Migrant Justice has, at various times, been able to rally against these arrests, to fight to free people from detention, and to stop their deportations using a variety of strategies that are collectively known as Not One More deportation campaigns. We've had a great amount of success in frustrating ICE's aims to detain and deport farm workers by putting strategic pressure on immigration courts, and immigration agencies in order to stop deportations. And at the end, we're going to come back to talk about that a little bit more as well. There is the sort of background of immigration, ICE, and Border Patrol arrests in the state. And at a certain point, through Migrant Justice's organizing, we landed on the radar of ICE. And in 2016, ICE began a targeted campaign of political retaliation against Migrant Justice that saw the detention of 24 community leaders and members of the organization. The ICE office in Vermont began to surveil the organization, to recruit confidential informants that they placed in Migrant Justice meetings, to report back on members' activities to their ICE handlers, and began to spread disinformation in the community to sow distrust and break down the bonds of community solidarity. When they would arrest people, they would say that they were given up by Migrant Justice as a way to sow distrust. This resulted in Migrant Justice in 2018 filing a federal lawsuit on First Amendment grounds to stop ICE's targeting of immigrant community leaders, arguing that it was a violation of the First Amendment rights to freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. This was a very hard-fought campaign, but was ultimately successful in winning a settlement with ICE where they dropped the deportation charges against the plaintiffs, paid restitution to those that they had unlawfully detained, and committed to no longer targeting Migrant Justice for its First Amendment protected activities. While immigration enforcement does continue in the state and the threat of deportation is very real, since the lawsuit, we have not seen the trend of targeted retaliations against the organization. So as these things are going on, at the same time, workers are looking at the conditions of the dairy industry. And in this large human rights vision for the organization, workers are advancing legislation and policies to protect their civil and political rights as immigrants, and they're also thinking about their labor and housing rights as workers. So in the early years of the organization, following patterns of other worker centers around the country, Migrant Justice began organizing on sort of a farm-by-farm, case-by-case basis. Workers would get organized on a farm, take collective action on the boss to get back stolen wages, or to get them to fix up poor housing, or to win a day off. And there were successes, but those successes were few and far between, and oftentimes rights won on the farm one day were too easily lost the next. So workers began a process of analysis where they started looking deeper at why are conditions this way on such a systemic level, and what have other organizations done in similar situations to transform the industries in which they work. And in that process of research and analysis, they came upon an organization of tomato pickers from southern Florida called the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, or the CIW. And from the tomato fields of Florida, the CIW had crafted a new strategy of worker organizing and a new model for social change called worker-driven social responsibility. And the theory behind this is that the driving force for exploitation in an industry, whether it's tomatoes or dairy, is not coming at the site of the employer-employee relationship, but rather is situated in the corporate supply chain itself. And this is a departure from traditional labor organizing, which looks at the work site as the principal battle, and workers winning contracts with their bosses to improve their labor conditions. What worker-driven social responsibility posits is that the widespread abuse in these industries can be traced to the corporate control over the supply chain, which creates a downward pressure on prices for producers and therefore a downward pressure on wages and working conditions for the workers at the bottom of the supply chain. And so if it's the corporations at the top of the supply chain that are responsible for the conditions that workers are experiencing, those corporations must be held accountable for being part of the solution. And what worker-driven social responsibility does is it flips this equation of exploitation on its head, and through worker campaigns and consumer pressure, pushes companies to sign legally binding agreements with the workers in their supply chain in order to reform their sourcing practices, to pay a higher price for the products that will be used to push producers to raise wages and improve working conditions. So in Florida, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers had created something called the Fair Food Program, which had been successful in winning agreements with 14 of the largest food companies in the world in order to change the way that they were sourcing tomatoes. And the program has since spread to other grow vegetables as well as flowers. So dairy workers traveled to Florida to meet with the tomato pickers at the CIW to learn from them about the model that they had created and the program that had done so much to change the tomato industry from what was once considered ground zero for modern day slavery in the United States to a more dignified industry where workers could make a good living and get a fair shake. Through a process of collaboration, they took the lessons from the Fair Food Program to create the Milk with Dignity program. So the way the Milk with Dignity program works is that Migrant Justice signs contracts with companies where they commit to only sourcing from farms that enroll in the Milk with Dignity program. When a farm enrolls in the program, they commit to meeting a worker-defined code of conduct created by the farm workers themselves that sets standards for wages, hours, benefits, health and safety, housing, and creates protections against all the things I mentioned: sexual harassment, violence, retaliation, child labor, human trafficking, etc. But it's not enough just to have a code. Workers need to understand what their rights are in the code. So a farm that joins the Milk with Dignity program has to allow Migrant Justice to come onto the farm, to provide worker-to-worker education, sitting workers and their employers down together to talk about what are the rights that workers have on the farm, and most importantly, how to enforce those rights. So the enforcement happens through an independent organization that Migrant Justice created called the Milk with Dignity Standards Council. This is a group of human rights investigators who staff a hotline, who conduct regular audits of the farms, and can impose resolutions and corrective action plans on farms to ensure that they're coming into compliance with the Milk with Dignity Code of Conduct. So farms that enroll get a guaranteed market through the participating corporation and also a higher price for their milk. And in response, they're committing to upholding and allowing for enforcement of workers' human rights. So in essence, what Migrant Justice has done is created in an industry where workers have historically been excluded from labor rights, where labor rights have not been enforced, have created their own set of labor laws and a parallel Department of Labor, a parallel OSHA, and enforcement mechanisms that have been created by the workers themselves for the workers themselves. So they have become frontline defenders of their own human rights in the dairy industry. So when workers created this program, they first approached Ben & Jerry's, which seemed like an obvious solution. A Vermont-based global dairy company that's made a name for itself around the world as a socially conscious brand, and Ben & Jerry's, of course, had taken many progressive stances over the years, but had never looked internally at what its dairy supply chain looked like and who were the ones milking the cows to put the cream in Ben & Jerry's ice cream. Ben & Jerry's initially resisted the call to join Milk with Dignity, and it took nearly 3 years of public campaigning of workers protesting in front of scoop shops, picketing board meetings, marching at one point from the state capitol to the Ben & Jerry's factory, a 13-mile march, until Ben & Jerry's finally came on board and in 2017 became the first company to join the Milk with Dignity program. And this was really a momentous occasion and the first time that a company had sat down with dairy workers in its supply chain and had signed a commitment to see them not at some remove, but as business partners who can be responsible for creating and enforcing the labor conditions in the company's supply chain. The program was implemented in 2018, and as you heard in the introduction, now covers over 50 farms, protecting the rights of 250 farm workers, and accounts for about 20% of Vermont's dairy industry. So this is a tremendous and historic win for farm workers in Vermont and the U.S. labor movement at large. And the transformation of conditions on those farms has been immense. Workers have seen drastic increases in their wages, have seen protections for paid sick leave, for paid vacations and paid holidays, things that are nearly unheard of on farms outside the program. Housing has been fixed on many farms. New housing units have been built. Health and safety protections have been enforced, and people have a place to go if they are experiencing harassment, discrimination, violence, with the Standards Council there to investigate and enforce resolutions on any violations of the Code of Conduct. And so there have been immense material wins through this program, but we really see the program as going beyond that because workers didn't call it, milk at $14 an hour. They called it milk with dignity because it's much more than just changing the material conditions. It's changing the nature of the relationship on the farm and changing what it means to be a dairy worker. That it's not about sacrifice and suffering, but it's about working a dignified job, living in dignified conditions, and being ensured the respect that you deserve as a human being. The change of power on these farms has been immense. I mean, where once migrant justice organizers would be run off the farm and called terrorists and suffer violence from employers, now, through the power of the program, they're welcomed onto farms to give education sessions where they sit down with the workers and the employers and say in front of the bosses, here are the rights that workers have. And if the boss is violating your rights, here's the number that you call. And farmers have to comply because they know that the economic incentives of the program are beneficial to the farm. So the impact of Milk with Dignity has been incredibly powerful, but 20%, while a good start, is just a start. So after the implementation in Ben & Jerry's, workers then looked to expand the program and selected as their next target Hannaford supermarkets. So Hannaford is the largest supermarket in New England, northern New England rather, and one of the largest dairy buyers in the region. So bringing Hannaford into the program would extend the protections of Milk with Dignity to dozens more farms and hundreds more workers, not only in Vermont, but around the region. Hannaford, just like Ben & Jerry's before them, has been resistant. They have initially ignored workers' requests to discuss the program, and then as workers began to publicly campaign and educate consumers about the human rights abuses in Hannaford's supply chain, they started out by saying, well, that may be happening on other farms, but we really just buy from small family farms. We don't really have immigrant workers. And so we went to the supermarkets and saw the production codes on Hannaford brand milk bottles. We're able to trace that back to the production facilities and then trace those back to the farms and say, well, actually, you are buying from these farms, at which point they said, well, we don't need Milk with Dignity's Code of Conduct. We have our own standards of engagement. We have our expectations for the conditions on farms that are supplying Hannaford brand milk. Some of those expectations, for example, they say workers shouldn't work more than 48 hours a week, which for any dairy worker, and as you heard earlier, is really a sort of laughable expectation. So when this was pointed out and workers continued to talk about the abuses and the violations that they faced, Hannaford set up what they call the Speak Up line. They said, okay, any worker who thinks that their rights are being abused can call the Speak Up line. It'll be investigated, and we got your back. So Migrant Justice supported workers on 10 farms to raise complaints with the line. The average time that it took to respond to workers was about 3 months, and then almost invariably when workers got the response, it was just for Hannaford to say, well, we investigated your complaint and we were unable to corroborate it. Workers were never interviewed, housing and work sites were never inspected. In cases where there were acts of extreme violence, where there were already police reports that Hannaford couldn't sweep under the rug, they just said, well, we spoke with the boss and stressed the importance of not committing violence against their workers. So this was obviously an insufficient response and really a mockery of workers' complaints. And so the next thing that they've announced now is that they are sort of setting up their own program with an industry group called the National Dairy Producers Federation, called FARM, F-A-R-M, Farmers Assuring Responsible Management. This is in essence sort of a human resource support for farm workers masquerading as a human rights program. They sent out self-assessments to their suppliers and asked them to fill out a survey, essentially, are you violating workers' rights, yes or no? And guess what? No violations were found. And so over time, what workers have said is that Hannaford has, in essence, created a knockoff program of Milk with Dignity, and a knockoff Milk with Dignity, replicating the program in form while not in function, while workers in their supply chain continue to suffer from abuse and exploitation. So workers have found many ways to put pressure and escalate pressure on the company. Marches, rallies, pickets of stores, going to the corporate headquarters in Maine on many occasions. I know at least one of you was at one of the Portland rallies. And organizations that previously received grants and sponsorship from Hannaford, like Vermont Pride Center. Hannaford for many years was the principal sponsor of the Vermont Pride Parade. A couple years ago, Pride said, if you want to sponsor this, you have to get with the program. Hannaford refused, and the Pride Center turned down tens of thousands of dollars in Hannaford donations and said, we cannot in good faith accept this. Yeah, you can give a round of applause for that. So the campaign has been continuing, and in the last year, workers have brought it international. So Hannaford is a U.S.-based subsidiary of a multinational corporation called Ahold Delhaize that's based in the Netherlands, that owns many supermarkets in Europe and the United States. So for the past 2 years, Migrant Justice has sent delegations to Amsterdam, and through organizing with shareholders in the company, have gained entrance into the company's annual shareholder meetings, where we've been able to directly confront the board of directors and executives as they gather to celebrate $100 billion in global sales and spend $1 billion in stock buybacks to enrich their chief shareholders and give lavish bonuses to their executives. Migrant Justice has been in the room to call them out for their abuse of dairy workers in their supply chain and their lack of due diligence in protecting those workers' rights. And what I think is a really powerful lesson in persistence and fortitude. Hannaford and Ahold are finally, in the past 2 weeks, starting to shift. After 5 years of stonewalling dairy workers, they, at their shareholder meeting 2 weeks ago in the Netherlands, announced that they would, for the first time, sit down with Migrant Justice to begin a dialogue about the Milk with Dignity program and launch an independent and launch an independent investigation into conditions in the dairy industry, which we expect to result in a recommendation that Hannaford join the Milk with Dignity program. This has been pushed forward by an international human rights complaint that Migrant Justice filed with the Dutch government 2 weeks ago as well during the trip to Europe, which creates a possibility for real pressure from Europe for Hannaford to join the program. So things are looking all right now. There's some progress on the horizon for the Milk with Dignity campaign with Hannaford. And this is really just one of the ways in which workers are looking to expand the program. Beyond Hannaford, farm workers are looking at other companies and engaging in not public campaigning, but private conversations with those companies, and also seeding new brands. So we expect within this year there will be a new brand of cheese that launches on the market with the Milk with Dignity logo, sourcing from Milk with Dignity farms. So keep your eyes peeled for that. And institutional procurement is another way. While corporate supply chains dominate in the industry, institutions like UVM are also buyers of dairy products. And whether it's higher education, K through 12, or hospitals, this is a way that people can put pressure on institutions to change their sourcing to Milk with Dignity farms as well. So the next step in the campaign is going to be next Thursday on May Day, International Workers' Day, at the Hannaford in Williston, Vermont. There's going to be a full-day picket from 7 a.m. when the store opens to 11 p.m. when the store closes. And we invite all of you to come out and join the picket line, show your solidarity with workers. And really, with hours like that, you can't say that you're busy, because at some point during the day, I know that you're free. So we have some quarter sheets. You can pass those back. If you already have the information, no need to hold on to it. I'm not sure I have enough for everybody. So while there is progress in the campaign, really now is not the time to let up the pressure. So the purpose of this picket is to begin or to continue to demonstrate consumer support for farm workers through a one-day boycott, what we're calling a don't buy or a don't shop action, that while workers are picketing the store, we're asking for consumers to turn around and shop somewhere else. We did this last year at May Day, and we're able to drop customers that day by over 300%. By over 300, about 20% of Hannaford's daily customers at the store that was being picketed. And we think we can beat those numbers this year with you all there. And this is really a way to show Hannaford that not only is this a reputational risk, a risk to their brand, but it's a risk to the bottom line, as consumers say that they will stand with farm workers and won't stand for exploitation in their milk. So we hope that all of you will join on May Day to stand with farm workers and to demand Milk with Dignity. An additional way that you can show your support is by filling out the Milk with Dignity Consumer Pledge. So what we're asking from everybody here is that you commit to never crossing a picket line while workers are picketing Hannaford. I mean, you should never cross a picket line anyway, but for the purposes of the pledge. And that if in the future workers call for a full store boycott of Hannaford, which they haven't yet, but if a boycott is called, that you'll respect the boycott. And gathering these pledges is a way also to demonstrate the threat of worker power to the company, that if they don't come to the table, things are going to keep getting worse for them. So I'm going to pass these back. Take a stack too, or a small stack, and you can either fill them out on paper, or there's a QR code that you can scan and fill it out on your phone. If you've already filled it out, no need to do it again. All right, and so now I just want to say a couple words about recent trends in immigration enforcement, because this continues to be part and parcel of what migrant justice does. And again, immigration enforcement and increasing repression against immigrant communities is part of the exploitation of immigrant workers. And to fight for human rights for immigrant communities, you need to both fight for labor rights and immigrant rights. I'm sad to report that last night there was a detention of 8 farm workers on a farm in Franklin, Vermont. About 5 Border Patrol vehicles rolled up onto the farm, went into one of the trailers of farm worker housing, and cuffed and pulled out 8 workers. This is the largest single arrest of farm workers that we've had in recent Vermont memory, and one of the largest workplace arrests in the state. Those workers are now being held at a Vermont jail in Swanton, are being placed in deportation proceedings, and we are going to be fighting to win their release and to stop their deportations. This is the largest enforcement action that we've seen of its kind in many years, but again is more of a difference in degree rather than kind. Migrant justice is building the capacity of the community in Vermont to protect itself from attacks from immigration agencies, and supporters are a big part of that. So Migrant Justice has a rapid response network of nearly 1,000 people around the state who get text blasts when immigration enforcement is happening, or when there's a potential for an immigration arrest, and people can show up to provide support for their immigrant neighbors. That happened this morning at the ICE office in St. Albans when Wendy Bernardo, who's a Migrant Justice member, a mother and caretaker of 7 children, a farm worker, and a community leader, was told that she had to report to ICE in a long-standing and ongoing immigration case. There was a fairly high risk of her being detained at this, and so we put out a call to the Rapid Response Network. 100 people showed up to the ICE office, and Wendy walked out a free woman. So for those who are not yet on the Rapid Response Network and who would like to be, we have a paper sign up to put your contact information, and there's a column to check Rapid Response. But if you want to save us a step, and for those who are more tech savvy, if you go to our website to the Get Involved tab, you can just put your information on there, and you'll see a space to say volunteer interests, and just write out Rapid Response, and you'll be added to the text blast, and we'll also put out opportunities through that for more trainings on how to become part of the network.
Those 8 workers that were kidnapped, is that public info yet?
It is public information, yeah. It's being reported on now. Right at the start of the lecture, the governor issued a public statement on it after receiving some pressure. It is going to become public. Migrant Justice is not publicizing the name of the farm out of concern for the workers who are still there, but the information is public, and you'll see a bunch of news stories on it when you get out tonight. Things are very difficult right now for Migrant Justice membership, for the immigrant community in Vermont. But what we've been hearing from members consistently over the past couple months is that workers are not going to give up the rights that they have fought so hard to win over the past decade and a half. Workers aren't going back into the shadows. They aren't self-deporting as Trump would like. People are here. They're here to stay. They're here to fight, and they're here to win. So thank you all for being here and being part of that fight, and I think we'll open it up. Thank you. Yeah, and on the quarter sheets going around, there's information about the 5 o'clock rally as well. I hope it's on there on the bottom. Yeah. You don't have to pass this around.
Yeah, could you step down a ways to ask a question? If it's not on, it's not.
I'll try to pass it over for folks who are able to get into the.
Thank you. So clearly, migrant justice in some ways is running like a labor union. Who pays the dues? Is it the farm or is it somehow the workers? How does the funding for migrant justice work? And was the farm targeted in Franklin a migrant justice farm? And if so, do you participate in trying to provide workers for those cows to get milked while those poor guys are in jail?
Yeah, and Migrant Justice is a workers' organization, but not a union. There are not membership dues for members of the organization. So great segue. One of the ways that Migrant Justice survives is through donations. With big appreciation for the Will Miller lecture series and providing an honorarium for tonight, we'd also like to pass the bucket and appreciate any cash donations folks are able to give tonight. Or we have a Venmo as well. So I'll get this going around. We also have merch for sale that we would love you to walk out with a Migrant Justice t-shirt, sweatshirt, or beanie this evening. So yeah, the organization is funded primarily by donors, primarily by Vermonters who support the organizing activities of immigrant farm workers. Of the farm arrests, it's a farm where Migrant Justice had has a very significant organizing presence. It's not a participating farm in the Milk with Dignity program. We don't think it was targeted by Border Patrol because of any particular association with the organization, and would not be involved in replacing workers who are detained. Yeah. Thank you.
Considering the critical labor that the migrant workers are providing to dairy farms, one would think that the dairy farmers would provide some sort of pressure against that. Is that happening at all, or not?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and there's interesting politics on that. I mean, essentially, the sort of the political truce that's been achieved from the political class of the dairy industry and elected officials with ICE is don't come onto the farms and we'll be okay. So Border Patrol and ICE have continued to arrest farm workers, but they do it at the grocery store and on county roads. And generally, the industry has been okay with that, as long as the arrests are happening at a rate that allows them to replace their workforce. And so it's not coming out of a humanistic concern. And that's not to say that individual farmers don't care about the well-being of their employees. And at this morning's ICE appointment, for example, she was accompanied by the farm owner and somebody who has a very close and warm relationship with her. So at a personal level, that does happen. But at an industry-wide level and looking at the politics of the industry, the sense has been, to do what you need to do, arrest people, detain them, as long as we're able to find other workers. This is, I think, going to be a real test case. We're going to see how the dairy industry responds to this. Scott's response today was tepid, I guess you could say. But I think this could be a time when farmers who overwhelmingly voted for Trump, it's a right-wing demographic. We'll see how they respond to this, and I think they could be a force to push back on immigration enforcement in the state. But I wouldn't hold my breath that they'll be a particularly progressive force in the matter.
What about Cabot, Agrimark, and Vermont Department of Ag? Where do they stand in all of this?
Yeah, so Cabot, Agrimark. So Agrimark is one of the two largest dairy cooperatives in the state, Agrimark and DFA, or Dairy Farmers of America. Cabot is a brand owned by that dairy cooperative. So all of the conditions that I talked about are endemic on the farms that belong to the Agrimark cooperative. So Cabot cheese, which I love just as much as the next guy, that's coming from farms where human rights violations are widespread. Some of Agrimark's milk goes to Hannaford. So having Hannaford join the program would be opening the door into the Agrimark co-op. And then Agency of Ag. Yeah, it's an industry lobby group essentially, and the Agency of Ag exists to promote Vermont agriculture, and the farm owners' interests are the Agency of Ag's interests, and they have not been allies in the struggle. And again, I'm speaking in generalities there. There are folks within the agency who would have different opinions, but in general, that's been the political impact of the agency.
In my sociology class, we learned about how migrant pregnant workers in Vermont are scared to go to the hospital to give birth because they fear that they'll be deported. I'm just curious if you've seen this and if the Milk with Dignity program has helped us.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. The question is that in her sociology class here that pregnant migrant women are sometimes afraid to go to the hospital to give birth, and how does Milk with Dignity program help with that? Certainly, workers forego medical attention because of the fear of immigration enforcement. That was particularly acute in the first couple of weeks after the inauguration. I haven't seen people doing home births because of fear of immigration enforcement. I think by and large, people who are pregnant are able to access medical attention, maybe at a reduced rate, less access to prenatal care. But one of the things that Migrant Justice has done is pass legislation to create something called the Immigrant Health Insurance Program, or IHIP, which acts as sort of a parallel Medicaid and Dr. Dinosaur for pregnant people and minors who can't access Medicaid because of their immigration status. So as of 3 years ago, anybody, regardless of their status, can get health insurance in Vermont if they're pregnant or if they're a child. And while
the building industry is an emerging market for immigrant labor, and I wonder if you have any comments about that.
Sure. A great question. So the question was, building industry is an emerging market for immigrant labor. What's Migrant Justice doing around that? In the past 3 years, we've seen a real transformation in the constituency of the organization and immigrant communities in Vermont. Traditionally, Migrant Justice has been a farm worker organization, mostly Mexican, and it's still primarily that way. But in the past several years, hundreds of new families have moved to the state, mostly from Ecuador, to find work in the construction industry. And a lot of longtime farm workers have also moved off the farms to start work in construction. There are some real benefits to that, getting off the dairy farm. pay is better. You're sort of less under the thumb. The hours are better, although still long. But there are also many abuses. So going back to the worker-driven social responsibility model, Migrant Justice and the CIW and others created a network about 7 years ago to promote this model and work with other organizations of workers in the United States and around the world to learn from the successes of the Fair Food Program, the Milk with Dignity Program. The biggest global iteration of this is called the Bangladesh Fire Safety Accords, a worker-driven social responsibility agreement in the Bangladeshi garment industry. And one of the organizations that we worked with is a worker center from the Twin Cities, Minnesota, called CETUL, Centro de Trabajadores Unidos en la Lucha, Worker Center of United in Struggle. That's primarily an organization of construction workers, and they created their own iteration called Building Dignity and Respect, and are campaigning against real estate developers in the Twin Cities to implement the BDR program. In December of last year, one of the largest construction firms in the state and one of the biggest employers of immigrant labor in the state, or one of the, I'll rephrase that, one of the largest construction workers in the state and one of the businesses in the state that has the largest immigrant labor force in its contracting chain, and I'll talk more about that, was in the news over some really scandalous living conditions that its workers were living in. They actually reached out to Migrant Justice and said, hey, well, Migrant Justice was quoted in some of the stories, and they said, okay, we saw you talking about us in the news, and we looked you up and learned about your Milk with Dignity program, and could you do something like that for us? So we connected them with our partners in the Twin Cities. They've signed an agreement of cooperation, and we're in the process of building that program to adapt it to Vermont's construction industry. And I think within the next month or two, we'll see that implemented with Vermont Construction Company. So they subcontract with a lot of construction subcontractors, which then employ workers. So it would work the same way as the Milk with Dignity program does, where they would require that any subcontractor that works on a Vermont construction project would have to enroll in the Building Dignity program, and workers would have all the same rights and protections as they do under the Milk with Dignity program. So a very exciting advance, and a real, again, testament to this sort of cross-regional, cross-sectoral worker organizing, where dairy workers had gone to Minnesota, had met with construction workers, told them about Milk with Dignity, mentored them as they created this program, and now it's going to benefit construction workers in Vermont. Thank you for waiting patiently. Sorry.
So I guess I have two questions, one, maybe three. What are the advantages to farmers that you referenced earlier, the advantages to joining the Milk with Dignity program as a farmer? And as consumers, how do we know what the best products to buy that are connected with, that are just products? And I guess I have one more question that if I want to throw into the mix. How do the farmers recruit workers?
Yeah, so the benefits to farmers to be in the Milk with Dignity program is because their buyer tells them that they have to join if they want to continue selling to the company. And they get a premium. In essence, you can think of it as a higher price for the milk. They get a premium which is calculated to essentially cover the cost of the compliance. So when farms have to give raises, start paying benefits, fix up housing, install new roll bars on their tractors, all those things are coming from the premium being paid by the company. And since joining the program, over $5 million in premiums have been invested in workers' wages and improved working conditions. So it's this real massive transfer of of corporate profits to worker well-being. It's an economic redistribution down the supply chain. So there's this economic incentive where you're getting this money, that's covering the costs, and then the better working conditions are on the farm, the less farms have to spend of the premium, and they can retain that for their business operations. So they benefit economically. And then farmers in the program also talk about, essentially what we're giving them is their own HR department and their own interpreters and translators to improve communication. There's lower turnover of workforce. People who are staying longer are able to do a better job. The bacteria count in the milk goes down. All these things that farmers are seeing benefits in having workers whose rights are protected. That's not to say that every farmer likes being in the program. Some really find it deeply offensive and resent it and think, who are you to tell me how to run my business? And my workers were happy before you all came along and started stirring up trouble. And so not everybody does it willingly, but there is a financial incentive. And if they don't comply with the program, then they can be suspended, which means they lose their market, they lose their ability to sell to a participating company, and they lose the premium that comes along with it. So there's a sort of a carrot and a stick model to it. The question about consumers. So at this moment, Ben & Jerry's is the first and only participating buyer. So they have Milk with Dignity on their website, and they have it in their social media channels, and we collaborate on some of that. We think it's important that customers understand the conditions in Ben & Jerry's supply chain, and we produce these reports, which Ben & Jerry's can then use to promote and have transparency on the conditions in its supply chain. This is really, it's something that we can make a business case to companies for, and one clear example is it's in the sort of business world, this would be referred to as risk mitigation of damage to brand. So a clear example of this is a couple years ago, there was a New York Times story on child labor in various U.S. industries that named, among many other companies, Ben & Jerry's. Child labor is quite widespread in the dairy industry. Workers as young as 14 are coming from Mexico and Guatemala, starting to work on dairy farms. U.S. agriculture in Vermont and elsewhere has many exemptions to child labor law, so there is sort of more legal child labor in agriculture than in other industries, but there's still unlawful child labor happening in the dairy industry. This article led to a lot of furor. There was congressional inquiries, a White House task force. This was under Biden. I don't think Trump would set up a White House task force about child labor. Maybe a task force to explore how to. And Ben & Jerry's alone among all those companies was able to say, hey, look, we have a program that prohibits this, that prevents it, that isn't just some corporate standard saying, oh yeah, no, we would never condone child labor, but we have transparency in our supply chain created by the workers themselves, and we could show you the evidence that any instances of unlawful child labor are being dealt with in a sort of human-centric, family-centric approach, not to just fire the worker and have them shuffle over to another farm where they're going to have even fewer rights, but working with families to get that kid back into school. And that's been really one of the effective parts of the program. So Ben & Jerry's, this is to their benefit. No company wants their name associated with child labor, of course, and so they were able to say, we actually have a program that tells us what the conditions are and that can ensure that these sorts of things aren't happening. So that's, I think, a really clear-cut example of what's a benefit to the company. And again, so yeah, you had asked about consumers. There's oftentimes the sort of like concept around conscious consumerism, right? That we vote with our shopping carts, and if I buy this brand of sneakers, then I'm better than if I buy this brand of sneakers. And we sort of try to push back against what we would call sort of like more individualistic approach to using one's identity or subjectivity as a consumer to bring about change. And where we see power driving, whether you're a worker or a consumer, is through collective action. So that's why more than just sort of like trying to say, you know, buy this brand rather than this brand, the way that we're mobilizing consumers is through collective action, through pickets, through perhaps eventually a boycott, and more using consumers to pressure companies to do the right thing, although, you know, it's also important to reward them when they then do it. While the program just has one participating buyer, we aren't considering like a label or a sticker for packaging, but that is something that could happen down the road. And you had a third one, I'm sorry.
It was about how farms recruit workers.
Oh, yeah. It happens in a number of different ways. There are some like labor contractors that act as conduits, but it's mostly word of mouth. It's you know, somebody's family member just got here from Mexico. They stay on their couch while workers kind of call around to other farms, see where there's a spot opening up, or a worker who's been here for 5 or 10 years decides to go back to their country of origin, and they're able to talk to somebody to come and fill their place. So it's fairly informal. There's not in most of the industry, there's not a very well-developed labor contracting system.
Hi, you mentioned the construction industry in passing. I'm going to give you a case in point of something I witnessed and experienced. I live in an apartment in a 4-story private house, and last year they replaced the roof shingles. The workers were all Central Americans, and this is a building with a very steep mansard roof, and a flimsy ladder from the ground to bring them up, take them down, and no safety harness or equipments, and the contractor did not even provide porto sand. And to relieve themselves, they had to use politely and gently knock on their door and use the facilities of the tenants in the building. So to me, that is a safety OSHA violation, and it's I'm sure it violates any number of safety codes in this city and in this state. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Did folks over there hear that?
No response,
yeah.
No comment?
I just wanted to make sure folks could hear it. So I mean, that is, that's the norm in this growing construction industry.
Incidentally, there were some pregnant women who were on top of the roof too.
Okay.
No harnesses attached to the chimney or what have you.
Yeah.
And they're standing quite a slant. Okay, I made my point.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's precisely the sorts of conditions that the Building Dignity and Respect program, when it's implemented, will address. It will create enforceable protections for health and safety, making sure workers receive sufficient OSHA training prior to working a job, have sufficient protective equipment, safety equipment on the job.
Contractor should provide bathroom facilities.
Yeah. All right, so we're coming up on time. Maybe we got one final one. All right, if not, oh yeah.
Well, actually, I keep thinking of City Market. It's a housing. I mean, it's run cooperatively, and you can buy socially responsible foods, but also not so socially responsible foods. Has there been pressure put on them? I mean, they have all kinds of supermarkets where they have they're owned by people. I mean, their motto was food for people, not for profit. And so, anyways, has there been any pressure on them put on them? Because when you said Cabot, I thought, oh yeah, they sell Cabot products.
Yeah. The question is City Market. Has there ever been pressure put on them around their dairy sourcing. There's been some conversations with them. The issue with a company like City Market is that they don't have their own brand products, and they're a relatively small buyer in the market. So their leverage on producers would be quite limited, which is sort of it's a technical and frustrating response to a question. If you're a City Market member, you should talk to the co-op and say, what can you do to support Milk with Dignity? And there are things that they could do, but it's a sort of longer term proposition, how to weave them into a larger process of change in the industry. All right, so I think we'll call it that. We just want to reiterate a couple of the calls to action. So tomorrow, 7:45, Waterman to march down to the Federal Building at 8 for the outside Moson's hearing. We'll also talk about the detention of the 8 farm workers at the rally tomorrow. And then next Thursday, May Day, 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. at the Hannaford and Williston, 5 p.m. At the Williston City Park, I don't know what you call it, to march to the ICE data center. All right, we hope to see you in the streets, everybody. Please turn in the consumer pledge forms. You got them. Thank you.